Hello, and welcome to the My Messy Church podcast. Each week, we'll be going through your questions from the weekend services and doing our best to present answers from a biblical perspective. If you haven't yet listened to the weekend sermon, I want to encourage you to head over to curtislake.org/media for context of what we will be discussing today. We love getting your questions and cannot wait to grow together. So, without further ado, let's dive into My Messy Church.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the My Messy Church podcast. This past week, we talked about the importance of understanding what the foundation of the church is and being faithful to maintain what that foundation is. Paul makes the comment that after he's laid this foundation in Corinth, that those who are building on top of it have to be careful in the way that they're building. And so it kind of speaks to I think the way, the means in which we're building the church, and so let's kind of dig into some of the questions that we had. The first one is related to the foundation. It says, "What is a practical way to maintain a firm foundation and preserve a simplistic or healthy perspective of God among a noisy world?" So when it comes to being anchored on a foundation, I think we can look at this. First of all, if we're talking about an individual, right? So at the personal level, how do I stay, grounded properly on a foundation that doesn't have me just kind of venturing out into left field with, my thoughts and my ideas. If you're thinking about my doctrine, my theology, my practice, how do I maintain a faithfulness to the foundation. And so I'd say on a personal level, what you need to do is actually, you really need to tie yourself to a church, to a healthy church, right? You need to, we all need to be part of a community that without that, I think it makes it too easy for us to either just kind of be out in a place where it's easy to die off, right? Or to get, to start adopting some very strange ways about thinking about things or seeing the world. So tie yourself to a healthy church. And by that, I mean, when you find a church, a good church that you can engage in, you need to invest in it. First of all, you need to invest in that thing, right? You can't just sort of casually associate with the church. You need to invest in it, meaning you need to pour some of yourself into it, right? Invest yourself in it. For most churches, there's a weekly worship service. If we're talking about Curtis Lake Church, you need to try to take advantage of the weekly worship service as often as possible, right? As if there's 52 weeks in the year that we're worshiping corporately on Sunday morning, unless there's a really good reason not to, or if you happen to be away, that should be a priority for all of us. And then I think there needs to be something that goes beyond that too, because you can actually participate in a worship service and still remain pretty anonymous and disconnected from the actual life of the church. And so you probably need to invest in something else. For us, in our culture, we have things like small groups that you can be part of where you get to be among some people who will know your name and you'll know their names, right? So it's this idea of knowing others and being known by others. There's ways that we can serve within the church or serve our community through the church, but figure out a way to invest yourself into the life of the church, right? That's going to help. That's going to help you on a personal level maintain a firm foundation, right? And then remember, I said you need to find a good church, a healthy church, one that is itself properly founded and grounded on what are the most important things, right? We talked about how the foundation is essentially Jesus Christ, right? He is at the center of everything. He is, both the understanding that Jesus Christ is the Son of God come into this world, crucified on the cross, in order to save and redeem the whole world, right? Like that's the foundation. That's the thing that we sort of center ourselves on. And if that's not really at the center, then there's a pretty good indication there that like the church corporately has strayed away from, and is now building in a way that probably is ultimately unhealthy. Next question is, how can you build a strong foundation? How can you build a strong foundation in Jesus Christ within your children when only one parent wants to strengthen their relationship with God? This is a really good question, a tough question. I can feel very sympathetic for the person, assuming the person who asked this is in that kind of situation, where you have one parent that has a priority for raising their children in the faith, of helping them to experience a world that includes God at the center of their lives, that sees the community of the church as something that's really, really important for them to be a part of. But then you have another parent who does not have those same priorities. And so I think one of the things we have to just be honest when we find ourselves in a situation like that is that this is going to sound kind of unfortunate, but like the burden is on you, right? When it comes to the spiritual well-being of your child, I don't think it's any mystery that burden is going to fall predominantly on you. That is, you're probably, unless you're really, really lucky, you're probably not going to get a lot of support from the other parent. Hopefully, if the other parent isn't necessarily like supportive or like, yay, I'm so glad that so glad that you and the kids are going off to church on Sunday morning and letting me do my thing. Sometimes it's far more toxic than that, right? Sometimes there's actually hostility that's created because you have two adults that are kind of moving in different directions, right? And that spiritual imbalance is actually creating some tension, especially when it begins, when the kids are brought into the picture, and what are the activities that the kids are going to be engaged in, right? And so you just need to recognize that. Again, just be honest with the fact that your priorities as a parent that wants to raise your kids in church and in faith, those priorities are going to be different from the other parent's priorities. And I do think it's important for you to honor just where your spouse is at, or the parent of your children. Just honor where they're at. Honor the fact that they, at this particular place or in time in their lives, like they have these priorities, and it shouldn't be too surprising for a parent that thinks, like, let's just say a parent thinks that church is it's just kind of silly, it's a waste of time, or you pick your favorite pejorative term. It's not hard to imagine why they would actually feel resentment for you taking the children that you have together, but that are that person's children as well. Why you're taking them, especially like let's say that the parent of the children has a bad relationship with the church. They grew up and just experienced harm, or just has a really, really bad opinion of the church, of institutional religion, whatever. Just like don't discount that. You have to understand where that other person is coming from, right? So honor their desires, but don't discount your desires just out of hand, right? Don't just defer everything. Then it's like, oh well, mom or dad here doesn't want the kids to go to church, and so okay, I guess that's that, right? I mean, honor their desires, but don't discount yours as well. Also, especially as kids are getting older, just realize that It's going to be very easy for your kids to be attracted to other things. We know that if your kids are involved in extracurricular activities like sports or, just other interests, dance, drama, whatever. A lot of times those activities, there's events that happen on Sundays, which now are competing with church attendance, right? It's all right. Am I going to let my kid do this, which means that they're not going to be able to go to church on Sunday mornings, which might mean that I can't go to church on Sunday mornings, or am I going to draw a hard line here and say, no, church is our priority? So it's just, understand that, again, especially as your kids are getting older and starting to think more independently, as they're being attracted to these other things, there is the potential for a lot of tension, even between you and the child, or they might just want to stop going. It might not be basketball during the winter. It might simply be that there's some friends that are getting together and having a sleepover on Saturday night into Sunday. And, those kids don't go to church, and your kid has been invited, and you find yourself in a position where you don't want to take that away from them or have them kind of on the outs with their friends. And so you let them do it. And then sometimes there's a tendency for that to happen more often than not. And, now all of a sudden your church attendance is very, very sporadic. So just understand that that's going to be part of raising your kids especially in a situation where you don't have both parents who are heavily vested in the life of the church, where it might be easier to kind of draw the line and say, it's like, okay, well, this is what we do as a family. We go to church. And so figure it out, we got to work this other stuff around that. I think sometimes you have to find this balance between, firmness and permissiveness, right? Not utterly permissive where church is no longer important or a priority, but also you don't want to have such a heavy hand in it, especially if your kid hates it. If your kid doesn't want to go to church, right, and you have a heavy hand in forcing the kid to go to church, now there's a chance that you're creating resentment in their lives. And so you might need, as a parent, to ensure that you're in a place where your church is set up, or your kids set up to really excel. So if you got a teenager and they're not being attracted to go to the youth program, we'll find out, why is it that they don't want to go to the youth program? Is it just simply a lack of desire on the part of your kid, or is there something that's kind of missing in the program for youth that's helping your kid to not want to go, right? Or if your kid despises going, you've got a second grader and they just despise going to church on Sunday mornings, it's like, okay, well, why do they despise that? Or why is it that they're so easily attracted to do something else? And advocate, ask questions, find out, is there something amiss in the environment or in the programming that's just not helping you as a family to raise your kid? Because at least from my perspective, our job as the church is to try to come alongside parents and help parents to equip their children to be followers of Jesus Christ. We have a part as a community to speak into the life of the family and into the lives of kids. And so if we're not doing a good job with that, then we need to address and fix that. And then finally, I would just say, make it a priority as best you can to try to surround your kid with other Christian kids. Figure out ways that you can help your child experience friendships among other Christian kids. The reality is, if your kid only has unchurched, non-Christian kids in their lives, then all of the priorities of that friend group that they're a part of it's going to have a tendency to pull away from being part of the church. It's going to have very little to nothing to do with, wanting to grow spiritually, to grow in the faith. And we need to realize that just like we as adults, we need community. I can't not have spiritual friendships and spiritual relationships in my life and expect to live successfully as a follower of Jesus. I can't do that on my own. All right. I say over and over and over again, we cannot live the Christian life alone. Same thing goes with our kids, regardless of how old they are. And so we need to look for ways, if your kid goes to a public school, which most of our kids do, they're developing friendships. And I'm not saying like, don't let them have friendships and community with kids that don't go to church. That, in fact, I'd say like, absolutely don't do that, right? We're not trying to like create this exclusive, very insular and closed in community where our kids don't have to rub shoulders with the unchurched. But neither have it such that your kids have no Christian friends, because it's just going to make it really, really hard for them to want to go to church. You can imagine if they're going to church and they don't have any friends there already, it's just going to make attending and belonging and all that stuff much, much more difficult. So again, I get it's a tough situation to be in, but I do think that there are ways that you can help kind of mitigate some of the challenges there. All right, the next question is, when should a church evaluate itself to ensure that it's still standing on the intended foundation and not shifting away? What does that evaluation look like? So when should a church? I think the when is there's not necessarily like these intermittent times that we ought to do. It's a constant thing. We know that the possibility of drift is always a real thing for us. It's personally, I if I'm not intentional about pursuing passionately my relationship with God, I'm going to drift away. Like spiritual formation and spiritual anchor, like being spiritually anchored and solid in your faith, just doesn't happen by accident. We have to be intentional. And so there is this constant vigilance. I love how some of the instruction that we're given as Christians in like some of the New Testament literature, it says things like to be sober, to be vigilant, right? To be spiritually alert, awake, and alive. Jesus, when in some of the parables that he expressed, he was constantly referring to how the people that are looking for and waiting for the master to return say, like, they need to be ready, right? Be in the state of readiness. And so we need to recognize that there is a constant need for us to have our eyes open and our ears open to whatever it is that God is, trying to get our attention on. Because if we don't, we're going to drift off. That's just absolutely the fact of the matter. I think that like the evaluation can look something like what it looks like for us now. I mean, we're walking as a church, we're walking through a letter that was written by Paul to a church and looking for how some of the various challenges that they may have been facing might also be challenges that we ourselves are facing. And it helps us to maybe take some inventory on our own church life and well-being and see, all right, is there a place here where we've kind of gone amiss and we need to get back to where we need to be? And so this might sound simplistic, but we need to learn from God's word, right? God's word is the standard. It is the measuring stick that helps us to determine where we are. And so we have the benefit of an entire kind of like early history of the church in the book of Acts that gives us some keen insight into what life was like for the earliest Christians. Long before it got all muddled up by a bunch of high-level church organization and denominations and complicated doctrines and all that, right? Like, it was a very, very simple way of being in spiritual community with one another as followers of Jesus. And so as we learn from what we see kind of exposed to us there in the book of Acts, that's helpful. And then we have all these letters, right? So 1st and 2nd Corinthians are just a couple of them, but there's other letters to other churches. Plus, Paul wrote to some church leaders. And so we can use all of that material together to help us to do an assessment of where we're at and how we're doing. We also need we also need prophetic voices, right? That God's people from whether you're talking about the nation of Israel, you'll find oftentimes, God raising up men and women that spoke prophetically to the community of God's people, sometimes who spoke prophetically even to individuals. And the purpose for that was because, again, just taking myself as an example, like I said, I have the potential of drifting, right? So there's that. I also have the potential of developing blind spots in my life, right? Things that, while in a lot of ways my heart might be kind of in the right place or oriented correctly, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm completely invulnerable to developing, some particular blind spot. And so, like, we need the prophetic voice to speak. We need, and by that, I simply mean that God raises up individuals. Sometimes they're people that are in official leadership capacities of the church, right? Like, when I preach on Sunday morning, I feel kind of a sense of, some prophetic calling where I am, I'm trying to declare and to speak, the word of God in a way that exposes things like sin and like where we've gone amiss and what needs to be corrected, how we need to return to God, right? Like those kinds of things. But even outside of leadership, I mean, the fact is God has gifted individuals, with a prophetic voice that may intermittently here and there have an observation that the church is it's not doing well in one place or another. And like, it doesn't have to be super mysterious and weird and crazy and all that. I mean, I think back to like one of the examples that we get from the book of Acts. Like, there came this point where the community was growing at such a pace that it was actually outgrowing the leadership structure that was there, right? You had the apostles that were kind of like carrying all of the load of managing this beast of a growing church population. And so what ended up happening is some very vulnerable segments of the church community were being neglected. And guess who didn't notice it, right? It was like the leadership didn't notice. Peter was busy fulfilling, what God had called him to do as one of the kind of chief leaders and preachers and the proclaimers of the gospel and all that, right? So he's doing that, and he doesn't really have eyes on the ground seeing how vulnerable people are being just completely neglected. And so, somebody has to have kind of this prophetic voice and bent that exposes where this has gone wrong, and then the church has the task of figuring out how to fix that, right? And so, in that particular story, when leadership became apprised of the problem that was happening, they went and they sought counsel from God and among one another to figure out how they would fix this problem. And they did it, right? They fixed the problem. So we need prophetic voices. We need people who are seeking God, who again, from a variety of areas within the life and the body of the church, can speak into the life of the church. And then when it comes to the assessment of our foundation, I think the questions are pretty easy. I think it's like, we can ask ourselves, is Jesus at the center of our adoration, right? Is what we have as a church community, is what we are adoring and falling more in love with is Jesus and not something else, right? If it's something else, that's a pretty clear indication that we've moved off the foundation. Is obedience to Jesus, right? So if Jesus is the center of our adoration, he told us, if you love me, keep my commandments, right? He's like, this is how it works. If you want to demonstrate actual real love for me, keep my commandments. And so we can ask ourselves, is obedience to the commands of Jesus at the center of our desires, right? Or are my desires pulling me in other directions? If they're pulling me in other directions, again, pretty clear indication that we've moved off the foundation. So I think it's really, really simple. Not easy, right? None of this stuff is ever easy, but it is simple. All right, the next question is, what do you think is causing so many people to join the Nones? For those of you listening, the Nones spelled Nones. This is a group of people that consider themselves to be religiously unaffiliated. So if they're filling out a survey that said, what religion do you belong to? They'd be checking the box that says none. And there's a growing number of people that are doing that. Like if you go back 100 years, you're going to find very few people that would consider themselves religiously unaffiliated, right? They're going to check some particular box, whether they're actually practicing their particular religion or not. They're going to consider themselves at least minimally affiliated with some particular religion, but not so much today. We have a growing, trending kind of direction, more and more people unaffiliating with any kind of religion. So why is that? This person asks. I think there's a variety of things that contribute to this reality. For one thing, I mean, we live in a state that is just far less religious than what what our populations have been in decades and centuries past, right? We're less religious because of the growing secularization of society. And things contribute to that. I mean, think about in the 1800s, you have the theory of evolution, which began to undermine things like human uniqueness, right? The theory of evolution teaches that everything essentially evolved out of some common ancestor through the process of natural selection. And so human beings are actually not anything unique and different from the rest. They just happen to be something that's a little more progressed, a little more evolved, right? So the fact that you lose something like human uniqueness, and also with that kind of undermining a lot of what had been very certain religious beliefs about God, about human beings. And so now, because of the theory of evolution, society has been given a possible alternative kind of existence that doesn't have to worry about God, right? If before such a theory was espoused, you had people largely believing in something like God, whether it was the God of the Jews and the Christians, or the God of other kinds of religion, polytheistic religions that had lots and lots of gods. There's always some belief in something other than kind of what you saw in front of you in the way of the physical universe. But while I think that the theory of evolution has some incredible problems from a scientific perspective, as well as just kind of this reality perspective. I mean, you still have the problem of, well, where did everything come from? It has, if I could say it this way, it has given people permission to just sort of write off something like the necessity of God as a being that we are ultimately accountable to, right? And so now you're helping to pave a way toward a more secularized society. We have the rise of secular humanism. The Archbishop of Canterbury in the mid 1900s, I think. His name was William Temple, and he defined secular humanism as this system that hoped to retain Christian values, right? It sees Christian values as being good, as being important, but it seeks to retain those Christian values without also retaining Christian faith. And so now, as opposed to humans being accountable to a God, you have humans becoming accountable to one another, right? You have a commitment to an ethic, certain standards of ethics, where we understand that, hey, if if we're going to do this, we're kind of on our own. We've got to do this right. And so the humanist sees human beings as being responsible for, for helping humanity to achieve its best good. Again, but like in the absence of God, and so this can be attractive, especially when you have a lot of negative things maybe happening in the name of religion, a lot of negative things happening in the name of Christianity. The rise of secular humanism sort of, again, retains those Christian values, which are good, but without what they would think is the baggage of, religious beliefs that vary from one religious system to another. Speaking of, some of the kind of the bad things that are done in the name of religion, we have a world that oftentimes looks at religion or the church. Like, let's just talk about the church. Some people think the church has a very indifferent view on matters of injustice, right? It thinks that the church is just kind of consumed with religious things and altogether indifferent toward, actual on the ground matters of injustice. And so it's not even fulfilling the very values that it is supposedly espousing, or the church, even worse, is actually perpetrating matters of injustice, or is part of the systematic problems of injustice. Right? We've seen things like that, in the institutions of religion over time. I was thinking about the like locally, we had the child abuse scandal of the Boston Archdiocese not too long ago that just rocked the Catholic Church, right? As it was discovered that there was some really bad stuff. Not only was there really bad stuff going on, but it was also just being covered up and swept under the rug. We know that there is always going to be a headline practically daily, probably, of things like clergy abuse, clergy greed, right? This super mega church or, mega ministry, pastor couple that's making millions and millions and millions of dollars and living in very, just living these lives of greed while the people that are contributing to that probably can't afford to be paying for their private jets and the other things that they're doing. A lot of times that religious institutions end up with fraudulent activity. There's a lack of financial integrity sometimes. Some have engaged in cultic practices that have, in some cases, led to mass suicides or other kinds of really, really weird things done in the name of religion. Some churches have really, really toxic culture. So anyway, there's all of this stuff that gets kind of thrown into the bucket of religion. And so a lot of people kind of throw their hands up and they're like, well, why do we need that? If we can live, if we can find a way to live ethically, well toward one another as human beings, if we can actually espouse these really, really good values without the baggage of religion, then why wouldn't we want to? And so something like the church can become less attractive for people to engage in. And then, there's I talk about this a lot because I think it's a real problem, and it's the reality of the very individualistic ways that we live our lives now. What progress has afforded us, industrialization, urbanization, a whole bunch of other Asians, probably that are contributing to the rise of individualism. I have the privilege of being my own person that gets to do whatever I want, right? Like that, I can very, very easily live my life with that kind of orientation, that I am going to pursue a life that is going to produce the best level of and the most happiness for my life. I'm going to go after hard those things that are going to make me the most happy. And when it comes to church, I mean, there's this individualism is expressed in the reality that we all have a whole bunch of different churches that we can choose from, right? We get to pick from the huge spread, the huge buffet of churches that are available to us. And if church isn't our thing, then there's lots of other ways that we can actually find community if that's what we're seeking. And so I probably shouldn't say this, but there's a lot more fun ways to be with people than, hanging out on a Sunday morning in a church service, singing songs and listening to somebody preach at you for an hour or so. And I think that's fun, but clearly lots of people don't, right? And so, yeah, it's getting cold outside, so I'll say, people join a snowmobile club, right? And now snowmobiling is a place that they find an activity that they enjoy, and also a kind of community and camaraderie that they can have a sense of belonging with other individuals. And it's very easy for something like that to just to replace some of the felt need that we have that we used to find in church community. So lots of different ways because we're individuals and we are very individualistic. Lots of different ways that we can seek after what makes us the most happy. And often, unfortunately, church ranks for a lot of people ranks pretty low. And I think that contributes to a more of the departure of people away from church. And then finally, when it comes to, there's a lot of people that would describe themselves as spiritual, right? There are all kinds of movements in the area of spirituality and spiritual growth, of people becoming more attuned with their spiritual selves that are outside of the domain of the church. And a lot of those pursuits of spirituality, again, they've been privatized. They invite people to find what works for them. And so instead of bringing our spiritual lives into community, which I insist is absolutely necessary, I can look for some other way to again, kind of like connect with the spiritual part of me that isn't necessarily connected to the community of a church. And so, yeah, I think those are a lot of the reasons why people are more and more unaffiliating, which has given the church the task of first of all, understanding or being introspective about are we responsible for some of this, at least some measure of it? When it, for instance, are we continuing to try to hold on to a particular kind of church culture that the world just finds utterly irrelevant? Well, if we're going to do that and not actually have some relevance for people, then yeah, we should expect that we're not going to see people attracted toward the church. I think there are some things that the church has been assigned and tasked to do and to be that only the church can do. So while, like I said, while a person can find a kind of community outside of the church, there is a kind of spiritual community that can only be found within the church. And so what we need to be doing is working really, really hard to become the kind of church that we need to be, so that when somebody wanders in for whatever reason, God brings somebody into our church community. It might be a person who's hurting, right? And that person who's hurting, while the snowmobile club may be great, they recognize that's not fixing the hurt that I'm currently feeling in my life. The church has to be a place where that hurting person can come and find help, right? Just like Jesus said that it is not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick, right? And he says, I have come to seek and save that which is lost. I have come to give life and to give life more abundantly. I have come to help those who are poor in spirit, broken in spirit. And the church, we continue on that commission in the name of Jesus. Like, we need to be that kind of place. And that's, I think, how we'll see, thinking about our community of Sanford and our surrounding towns here, like that's how we're going to be a place that's going to attract people to our community that'll find themselves, instead of being not religiously affiliated, find themselves actually giving their lives to Jesus. Next question is, how can we lovingly correct and support our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who are struggling with their faith in the Lord? So I don't know what what the person means by struggling with their faith. So if it's, the person is struggling because of, some kind of difficulty that they're experiencing, like some challenge, and like they're walking through a hardship that's causing them to really kind of struggle with their faith, then I'd say that what we need to do as brothers and sisters is just support that person, right? We need to come alongside. We need, our faith needs to be strong enough to kind of help carry them through that time of difficulty that they're experiencing themselves. Are they struggling in the sense that they're kind of distancing themselves away from the church? They are, for whatever reason, a reason that may be known or unknown to you. They're just, it might manifest in such a way that they're attending less, or they stop coming to small group, or they're no longer serving, and they just seem to be drifting away. If that's the case, then I think as a person that's in their lives, a person that has a relationship with them, we need to keep after them, right? We need to be there for them. We need to love them unconditionally. Recognize that while they may be distancing themselves, like, let's be the kind of person that's not going to allow them to distance themselves. Let's keep putting ourselves in their lives, not in an obnoxious way, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that helps that person to know, hey, like, I'm here for you, and for whatever you need, right? Like, if you're kind of feeling like you're on the outs with the church for whatever reason, or there's just something there. I mean, that happens. That unfortunately, that happens all the time. Maybe it's because the preacher said something that he shouldn't have said, or there was some other kind of relational conflict that just has the person feeling like, I don't need that, and so they start distancing themselves. Or maybe it's possible that the person is they've let something creep into their lives. They've kind of opened the door to some sin or something that sin has a way of pulling us away from God, and so whatever the reason is, just be there for them, keep after them. Or are they struggling with doubts? Like, is the question that, they're really struggling in their faith, and that like they're just starting to be overwhelmed with doubts about various things. Well, have a conversation, find out what those doubts are, and then maybe do a deep dive. I mean, there's all kinds of resources out there when somebody's questioning something or another. There's so much good stuff. And so you could ask for some help on resources that might help you and another person kind of walk through to help alleviate some of those doubts. All right. Next question is, you talked about tithing. Can you explain the point? Well, all I did really was make it funny. I thought it was funny. Showed this big lavish house and said that, it belonged to a church member that wasn't tithing. So I wasn't really trying to make a point, except for, just a little tithing jab. But anyway, since somebody has asked, I did not type this in myself. I don't want to be accused of that. Since somebody did ask, let me just explain, kind of 5,000 foot view, my view of tithing. going back to the beginning, tithing was like an act of obedience to God, right? So the tithe means the tenth part. And the idea, I think, behind the tithe was that the person, through the giving of the tithe, was recognizing that everything comes to us from God. And so what we do in response to that acknowledgement is not just simply acknowledge it. We actually do something to acknowledge it. We bring back the first tenth. We bring that back to God as a recognition of the fact that everything he has given us comes from him. There's a place where God actually he does an assessment of his people, right, the nation of Israel, and accuses them of failing to bring the tithe, the whole tithe, to the house of the Lord. And so he accuses them of robbing him, right? The fact that they were unwilling to bring the tithe, God calls that robbery, right? So again, the tithe was an act of obedience. Now, it is certainly arguable whether the tithe is this timeless kind of tribute and commandment that we as Christians are supposed to continue to follow and observe, or whether we're free from it. I kind of think it's both of those things, right? We are free from the law. And so we don't fulfill the matters of the law as an obligation, but it doesn't mean that the law of God is not important. And the tithe is interesting in that it does seem to have some continuity from the old covenant into the new, right? And so we could go into this whole theological thing about it. The truth is, the tithe. We see tithing happening even before the law was instituted, right? Like Abraham gave a tithe, and that was before the law was ever made. And so, again, arguable whether or not it's, as a Christian, I am obligated to tithe. But I do think it's important to remember that, like, there's some benefits to it. One of the benefits of the tithe, both for the nation of Israel as well as for the follower of Jesus today, is that it reminds us that everything we have comes from God, right? When I bring a tithe, there's a physical, tangible way that I am recognizing that everything I have comes from God. Also, I really believe that it helps to break the power and the cycle of greed in our lives. The truth is, if I take all of the money that I earn and I just do with it whatever I want, possibly, like, if there's something left over at the end, then, maybe I donate or give some of it away. That is a very greedy way, very self-centered way for me to live my life when it comes to my money. So the tithe, it breaks it, right? Like the tithe interrupts that, because it doesn't just give God leftovers that might be left over. It gives God the first tenth. It says, okay, I made $100. First thing I'm going to do is give 10 of those dollars back to God. And then, I have some freedom to do with the other 90, what I want to do. And so, it breaks the power of greed in my life. And then there is a benefit in that it is a means by which we contribute to the expansion of God's kingdom, right? And this is what I mean by the fact that there's some continuity. For the Jews, the tithe was used to support the place of worship, right? Where the Jews, where they worshiped, a place that they benefited from as individuals and as a community. And so the tithe helped support the work of that. And it seems like it's appropriate for the local church to be supported in a similar way, right? I mean, we don't. The reason why we exist as an organization and as a church community, the reason why we can have a building, and staff and investment in various ministries. The reason why we can do that is because of people's faithfulness in tithing, right? That contributes to the expansion of God's kingdom. And so bottom line, like, when it comes to tithing, from my perspective, this is how I would encourage a person to try to, to think, or, to, like, challenge the way somebody approaches their personal income and expenses. For me, the tithe is a starting point, right? It is that first 10% it's just simply a matter of obedience. I ought to be giving that without any thought. That belongs to God, right? That's the way I understand it. And then beyond that, I think the New Testament ethic when it comes to our money is that, well, it's not actually just the first 10% that belongs to God. It all belongs to God. It is all his. I'm just a steward. I'm a custodian of it. And so I actually have a responsibility, even with the other remaining 90%, to do with that, to manage that money in a way that would make God very, very happy, that would please him. And so, I want to grow in my spirit of generosity. I want to be sacrificial, right? So the tithe is the starting point, but really I ought to be freeing myself up to make offerings even above and beyond that, to be generous and sacrificial with that. And then final question for today is, how do I figure out what God has given me to work with? How do I figure out what God has given me to work with? I think, honestly, I just say, look at what you have. Look at what you have, right? That's what God's given you. I think sometimes it's hard for us to be honest with what we have. We reserve or are very conservative with what we think we actually have available to us. So we need to do this honestly. Honestly, look at what you have. We often talk about these three buckets of our lives that we can use to invest ourselves. However you want to see it. Invest in the church, invest in other people, invest in the expansion of God's kingdom, right? And the first thing that we can look at is, how are you investing your time to expand God's kingdom? How is your time actually being spent? Just look at it, do an assessment, and see, is your time being used in a way, again, that if you could think about what it would look like to stand before Jesus, right, our Lord and Savior, our Master and our King, and show him the time log of your day, of this past week, right? Is he going to look at that and be pleased with the time that he has given you, which represents your life? Second thing we can look at is our talent. How are you using your talent, again, to expand God's kingdom, to make a difference in the lives of other people, to demonstrate the love of Jesus to people that God brings into your life? By talent, what are you good at? What do you love? What is it that makes you uniquely you? Are you using the way God has made you? Talk about, what has God given me to work with? Well, God's given you. You are who you are. And while we may sometimes feel, less than excited about what exactly God has made us, the reality is we each have a unique way that we can contribute into the lives of other people. And so how are you using that talent? And then finally, how are you investing your treasure, right? So I just talked a whole bunch about tithing and giving. But really, is your money, look at your money. Where's it going? Is it only going into things that last just a little while? Or is there a portion of it that's going into things that last forever? Look at, what is it that your heart treasures? What is it that you love more than anything else? I think about, in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, if you're familiar with that at all, right? One of the kinds of characters in those movies are the dwarves, and the dwarves are consumed with a love for gold, right? They're constantly, their heart is just, it pines for and is bent toward gold. And you can actually see when they are in the presence of gold, everything about them changes, and they become their hearts become consumed with that thing, right? And it's a lesson about how there are things in this world that can really grab a hold of our hearts and take possession of our hearts, and so we need to look at, what is it that my heart is pining for? What is it that I love more than anything else? And say, do I love that thing Or maybe do I love that person even more than God? If the answer to that is yes, then it's like, okay, well, now I have something that I've put in front of God, and that's going to make it hard for me to actually give my treasure, give the thing that my heart loves the most back to God. But that's exactly that's what God's given me to work with. He expects me to use it in a way that honors and glorifies him, and that also, I think, demonstrates a love for other people. So, all right, that's it for today. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of My Messy Church. If you haven't done so yet, be sure to head to your app store and download the Curtis Lake Church app for easy access to all of our content. Thank you so much for joining us, and we can't wait to be with you next week.